Hi, welcome to the Spirit of Prophecy. I'm your host, Luther Mark. In this video, we'll be getting into Revelation chapter 4. So let's get into it. So as we get into it here, just a few things to remind you, again, to kind of set the tone. Number one, it's not about religion. It's about a relationship. And so in the previous chapters in the letters to the churches, I talked a lot about the rewards that we can get and the crowns and stuff like that. But we should always remember that's not why we're believing. It's not our main motivation. Our main motivation is Jesus. And Jesus gives us eternal life. So if anything, that is our motivation, that we can know God personally through His Son, Jesus Christ. And so again, it's not necessarily about religion. It's about a relationship. And it's a relationship that you may not have, that you can have. And so let's just get into it. Let's discover what's in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. And let's pull out the meaning that is in there. Now previously, I've talked about a lot of things. And again, when we read these words in these chapters, we don't want to put things into it. We want to read it and try to pull out the meaning. That means we want to literally interpret what's there. And so that's what we're hoping to do. And I just want to remind you a verse from Proverbs, and Proverbs 25:2. And it says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it is the glory of kings to search out a matter." And so that's what we want to do. We want to get into this, and we want to really pull out the meaning. We want to search the scriptures and see what God's trying to tell us. And going a little bit further, there's more. With God, there is always more. So we can see what's going on here in the rest of this verse. It says, "Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to Him, God, who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever." It says, "The 24 elders fall down and they worship Him, and they cast their crowns and they say, 'You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created.'" And so they're giving Him all the honor, praise, power, and glory. And they worship Him. They cast their crowns at His feet. And so there's something going on here. And what I want to suggest, sometimes it's better if we can look at things from a Jewish perspective, or it will help us to understand our Christian things if we can look at it from a Jewish perspective. And so there's a lot of people that will say that Revelation chapters 4 and 5 have to do with the rapture of the church, and that it's one vision. And then I've heard it taught that there are actually two visions there, that there's Revelation chapter 4, which is a vision, and then you have Revelation chapter 5, which is a vision. That chapter 4 has to do with the rapture, and then chapter 5 has to do with what happens once people are raptured in heaven. Now, I will speak and say that I do not agree with that. I think we have to learn to rightly divide the word. Now, I would like to read something to you. And I'm just going to read a little bit from my book here. It's called God Authentic. And just read a couple paragraphs. It says, "Regarding the book of Revelation, it's very important for you to know and remember when John first wrote this book, it was not written in chapters and verses as we see it now. The chapters and verses were added much later when the Bible was edited, printed, and made into a book. The most popular and long-standing version is the King James 1611 version. This version was initially created and published for the purposes of availability, understanding, and to help with retention of scriptures. Therefore, what we can understand about this is when it was first written, there was no chapter 4 or 5. Okay? And there certainly weren't verses. And so to learn to rightly divide the word, it helps us to understand things from a Jewish perspective and to understand what might be going on here, because John's being shown a vision. And so what I'm about to tell you is a little radical and a little revolutionary, but it's kind of how the Lord showed me a few things. Okay, here's basically what I want to tell you. When we look at the book of Revelation, we have to be aware and understand a little bit about God's timing, and we have to understand how God looks at things a little bit. And so sometimes God compresses things. And what I mean by that, there's a verse in Revelation chapter 12. And it's in verse 5, Revelation 12:5. And it says, "She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne." Now we know when Jesus was resurrected, he was called up to God. But we see that sentence, it starts with, "She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was called up to God and his throne." So what I'm trying to point out there is sometimes God jumps in time. Within one chapter, within one verse, within one sentence. And so we have to be aware of that in Revelation. And so when we're reading Revelation chapter 4 and 5, we have to recognize the scene. Because when we get to Revelation chapter 5, there is a different scene. In fact, I would suggest to you that within Revelation 5, there's two scenes. So Revelation chapter 4 and 5 could make up a total of 3 visions. Now, you may have never heard that before, but what we're seeing here and what we can try to understand is John is being called up to the third heaven, and Jesus is going to show him something. But what we have to realize when we read about this, other than that trumpet telling him to come up here, the number one thing we can notice is it is a scene of heaven. We see the Spirit of God on the throne. John sees the Spirit of God on the throne. He sees the 24 elders. He sees the 4 living creatures. But what we can notice is Jesus is not there. Now, maybe Jesus is with him, but John doesn't describe seeing Jesus. He just hears a voice saying, "Come up here." And the door is open, and he has this vision in the throne room of God the Father, the angels around the throne. There's 4 living creatures there. The 24 elders and thrones are there. So what could this be? And so when we really think about it, and we look at it from a Jewish perspective, there are 7 feasts or celebrations of the Lord. And what we can try to understand within these 7 feasts, the first feast is the Feast of Passover, then there's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then the Feast of the First Fruits. And these first 3 feasts happen in the springtime. Now, people that study scriptures that know about the feast, they know that these first 3 were fulfilled with Jesus' first coming 2,000 years ago. And so there was Passover, there was a Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then the Feast of First Fruits, I will suggest to you, the first fruits were the people from the Old Testament that were raised with Christ. That being the 24 elders, they were raised with Christ at his resurrection. And so quite possibly what we might be seeing here, because we can understand that within these 7 feasts, because you have the 3 in the spring, and then in the summer you have Pentecost or Shavuot, which is the feast or the harvest in the summer. And then in the fall, there's another harvest and 3 more feasts there, and you have the Feast of Trumpets, you have the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacle in the fall. Those that have not happened yet. Now, we've already experienced the first part of Pentecost. Now, I've already alluded to it. Within the 7 feasts, there are 3 harvests of the Lord. There is the spring harvest, which is the Feast of First Fruits. That is what I'm suggesting has already happened when Jesus was resurrected the first time. He took people with him from the Old Testament. Now is the time of the summer harvest. We are in that time frame before the summer harvest that began on the day of Pentecost. Will it end on the day of Pentecost? Probably not, but it will end toward the fall feast, okay? And so what we can understand is we live now in the time of the summer harvest. And for us who are believers, we are the summer harvest, or we can be the summer harvest, which will conclude at the end of summer, okay? But that's what Pentecost celebrates. It celebrates the time of the summer harvest. And so the summer harvest began at Pentecost. Important to say that. The summer harvest began in the time frame of the day of Pentecost, okay? And it will conclude at the end of the summer harvest. And then you can go into the fall harvest as well with the Feast of Tabernacles and so forth and what that represents. But what I'm pointing out is there are 3 harvests within the 7 feasts. The first harvest, the Feast of First Fruits, has already happened. We're in the time frame of the second harvest, or what will be the second harvest. And then the final harvest, the third harvest, which occurs in the fall time frame, represents that third and final harvest at the end of the millennium. That's the final harvest. The fall harvest at the end of the new millennium, at the end of the 1,000-year reign. So the second harvest, the summer harvest, ends at the end of our current time, at the end of the summer harvest, at the end of the time of the Gentiles will be the summer harvest. And then the beginning of the fall harvest. That will be the second harvest, the summer harvest, at the beginning, at the end of this current time frame, and at the beginning of the fall harvest will be the summer harvest. Okay? So there are 3 harvests. So again, we're in the time frame of what will be the second harvest. So having said that, what I'm suggesting to you here is that there were people who were raised with Jesus at his resurrection. They are known as the first fruits. They represent the feast of the first fruits. And here's what I'm suggesting to you strongly. This first vision that John sees here in Revelation chapter 4, this is the vision of the first fruits, the first harvest, which would include the 24 elders. 24 elders from the Old Testament. Now, there were probably more, but that's what John saw when he was there, was at least 24 of all the people who were harvested at the first harvest, the spring harvest, okay? The feast of the first fruits. That's what I'm suggesting that this is, and that is what we're seeing happening here, is John is seeing a vision of the feast of the first fruits, okay? Now, let me see if there's anything else that I want to tell you here getting started. There will be 2 more visions, and guess what they represent? They probably, and we're going to see it, represent the next 2 harvests. So what's important for us to understand is we can know and understand, number 1, when Jesus was glorified. Number 2, we can understand that Jesus is coming back again based on everything that we see and learn. He will come back for a second harvest, okay? And then we can also understand when the last days started. Now, we're going to be getting into all of these 3 things further on in this teaching. And I hope this has helped you. I hope you've learned something here. Let me see if I've skipped anything here. Okay, I can see that I did, and it's an important thing to point out. It helps if we can understand God's timing, okay? And I just talked about the feast. Now, the Lord has given, to the Jewish people, He gave it to them 7 feasts, which represents God's timing of things that He's going to do. And so each one of those feasts commemorates something, and it also tells a story about what God has planned in mind. Now, to understand God's timing, there are a couple verses in the Bible that I just want to read to you, and because there's a couple ways that the Lord looks at timing. Okay, so here's one verse. It's from Psalms chapter 90, verse 4, and it says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past." For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday. In other words, that's kind of implying from the Old Testament that one day is equal to 1,000 years. Now, this seems to be something that's common knowledge. A lot of the Jewish people know this. However, we should as well as being Christians, because 2 Peter makes it much more plain that one day can be equal to 1,000 years in God's timing. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, it says, "Beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day." In other words, this is a prophecy for the end time. And so it's long been thought and taught, we talked about the menorah, and there being 7 candles on the menorah. It's often taught from a Jewish perspective that God has a 7,000-year plan for mankind. And we can understand that Jesus came from the time of Adam to the time of Jesus was 4,000 years. And so with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years. So each candle on the menorah would represent 1,000 years. And Jesus came right in the middle at the end of that 4th candle. And so Jesus represents the 4th candle. And even if we look at Genesis, we can see that Jesus is the light. The sun and the moon were created on the 4th day. But don't forget, Jesus is the true light. And so when we think about it, there's a lot of symbolism that can go on with that. But what we should know, that we should understand and know that it's been 2,000 years since Jesus was here. Now, in God's timing, that represents 2 days. It's been 2 days since Jesus was here. So what that all means is that we're coming to the end of the 6th day, or the 6,000th year. Therefore, there remains 1 day or 1,000 years, which is the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the new millennium. So as we approach the end of the 6th day, this is another way that we can know that the Lord is coming back very soon, probably in our lifetime, if not my lifetime, your lifetime, especially if you're younger than me. But just know the timing is there, and that's something that we're not to forget. We can also see in prophecy where 1 day is equal to 1 year. I think I've already talked about that earlier, like with in the letters to the churches and the persecuted church. So anyway, so we can understand in God's timing 1 day is equal to 1,000 years, 1,000 years is equal to 1 day. And just a little message about that the Lord gave me. The reason that it's written that way, when we think about time, we think about time before Christ and we think about time after Christ. So 1 day is equal to 1,000 years before Christ, and 1,000 years is equal to 1 day after Christ. God does not change. And there is one more way that God looks at timing. And again, you have to go back to the Jewish roots and the Old Testament to understand this third way of God's timing. But it will become important as we go through the book of Revelation to understand this third way that God keeps time. So 1 day is equal to 1,000 years, and prophetically speaking, prophetic timing can be 1 day is equal to 1 year. But there is another way that God looks at timing, and that's the Jubilee cycle. And what the Jubilee cycle is, most people say it's 50 years, but it's really 49 years. And it's 7 cycles of 7 years. And so 7 times 7 is 49 years. Now, the important thing about that, they end a Jubilee cycle in the beginning of the next year, which would be the 50th year. And so they have a big feast, a big celebration, and that's a Jubilee year, they call it. And it's a time of refreshing and a time of return and that kind of thing. But technically, that 50th year that ends the cycle is also the first year of the next cycle. So there's a pattern there I want to go ahead and point out. Sometimes God overlaps things. So that's what he does with the Jubilee cycle. And it's important for me just to tell you about that the Jubilee cycle is 49 years. They celebrate the Jubilee year in the 50th year, which happens to be the first year of the next cycle. They overlap. So it's important to know those 3 time frames. Now, having said all that, if I am correct in my interpretation, what we have seen here in chapter 4 in the book of Revelation is a vision that John's being shown of the first feast, the feast of first fruits. In other words, he's being shown a vision of the first harvest. So in a way, it is a type of rapture. It just may not be the one we think, because when John's told to come up here, we think it's a rapture for the church because it comes after the letters to the churches. But remember, John's having a vision. He's told to come up here. It is a type of rapture for John to the third heaven. Remember, Jesus has an open door to the faithful church. And he's being shown this vision, I would suggest, of something that has already happened. In fact, what I am suggesting to you is the vision that John is seeing here of the third heaven. What I'm suggesting to you is that this is the feast of first fruits. In fact, when the 4 living creatures are there, and when the 24 elders fall down and worship him who sits on the throne, and they give him all the honor, praise, and glory, and they cast their crowns, what I am suggesting to you is that perhaps John is being shown the vision of the 24 elders casting their crowns for the very first time as the vision of the first fruits, the harvest of the first fruits. That's what I'm suggesting. Now, has John already seen it? That's yet to be determined. But John's being shown a vision of something that's already happened, the Feast of First Fruits. And this vision helps to explain some of God's timing for things he has done, things he is going to do, and at that point in time, and things that come after this vision. So I hope that helps you in some way. I hope you got something out of it. And if you like this video, Please like it and subscribe to my channel. There's a lot more coming that I can tell you. Again, things you've probably never heard, but you're going to hear them from me. And again, it's things that I've learned from other people and things I feel like the Lord has shown me. I do have one last verse to give you, and it is from Hebrews chapter 2, verses 7 through 9. And it has everything to do with where we're going in chapter 5. So I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. And it's got everything to do with chapter 4 as well. And again, this is a teaching that I don't think probably half the Christians out there know or understand. And I'm going to read it to you right now. We'll end with this. It says, "You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, and set him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we do not yet see all things put under him, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, for the suffering of death crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone." Again, that's Hebrews 2, 7 through 9. And so I would suggest to you that all things have already been put under him. A lot of people teach, that what we just read was the pre-trib rapture, and that there'll be a marriage supper of the Lamb when Jesus comes back for the rapture, and that then all things will be put under his feet, and that we will come back to the earth with him, and he will rule and reign for 1,000 years. But they believe what I just described will happen at the marriage supper of the Lamb after the pre-trib rapture. Now, again, we didn't read any of that. That's why I believe, and I think, pulling out what's there, I do not agree with chapter 4 of Revelation having anything to do with the pre-trib rapture. And one of the reasons is because people lack an understanding. He's already king of the universe. All things have already been put under his feet. You see, it was always God's plan from the foundation of the world that salvation would come through the Son. The big question I'll leave you now with, and we're going to answer in chapter 5, is when were all things put under his feet? When did the last days begin? If you like this video and like to see more, be sure to check out my website. It's www.coolcombat.com, because we battle against powers and principalities. But the cool thing is the war has already been won. We may have battles to fight, but the war has already been won by Jesus Christ, our King, King of the universe. All things have already been put under his feet. You can also check out my YouTube page, which is www.thespiritofprophecy.com. I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of it. Stick with me. I'm going to continue to show and tell you things probably you've never heard or seen before. And it's all about the book of Revelation. It's all about the good news of God. I thank you for watching. Be blessed.